There is a particular kind of silence that soldiers learn to fear. Not the silence of empty fields or quiet nights. Not the silence of a base between shifts or the low hum of a radio channel with nothing coming through. Those silences are ordinary. Soldiers sleep through those. The silent soldier's fear is the one that shows up uninvited, the one that arrives mid-movement, mid-breath, mid-step, when something in the air just stops. When the birds go quiet before you notice they were singing. When the wind drops, and the leaves freeze, and the whole world holds itself still like it knows something you don't. Every soldier who has lived long enough has felt it at least once. Most of them, the moment they felt it, whispered a prayer and picked up speed and got out of wherever they were standing. Because that silence is not peace. That silence is a decision being made about you, somewhere above you, somewhere ahead of you, somewhere you cannot see, by someone you have not yet seen. On a cold autumn morning, deep inside territory that military maps marked with red hatching and the word hostile, a 12-man scout unit moved through a pine forest in tight formation. They were professionals. They had done this kind of work for years. They moved quietly. They checked their flanks. They communicated in hand signals and kept their spacing disciplined and their eyes open. They were good soldiers. They were also, though they did not know it yet, already inside someone else's plan. 3 kilometers ahead, 2 kilometers to the left, 1 kilometer above on a rocky ridge lined thick with cover. The enemy had been watching them since dawn. Watching and counting and radioing positions and drawing the unit deeper into the valley like a fish being guided toward a net. The encirclement was patient work. It had taken hours to set up. By the time the scout unit would have realized what was happening, the exits would already be sealed. They had 47 men positioned. 47 against 12. They were thorough. They were coordinated. They were confident. What they did not know, what no one on that ridge had thought to check because the idea had not occurred to them to check for it, was that the high ground directly behind their own position had been occupied since before sunrise by a single person. One person, alone, with a rifle. She had been lying in the same spot for 6 hours. She had not moved. She had not eaten. She had barely breathed. She had watched 47 men set up their trap, and she had counted them and mapped them and made her calculations in silence. And now she was waiting the way only certain people can wait, the way that is not patience so much as it is predation, for the moment when the trap would spring. Because that was the moment she would become the most dangerous thing in that valley. Her name was Sergeant Yeva Marchenko. She was 26 years old, and she had already decided how this was going to end. This is the story of what happened next. The forest had a smell that Yeva Marchenko had memorized the way other people memorize faces. Pine resin and wet soil and something faintly metallic underneath it all like old blood or cold iron, the kind of smell that told you a forest had been a battlefield before and remembered it. She had been lying in the same position since 4 in the morning. Her body had stopped complaining about the cold somewhere around the 2nd hour. By the 3rd, she had stopped being a person in the normal sense and had become something closer to the rocks and roots around her, still patient, integrated into the landscape in a way that required years of training to achieve, and something much harder to name to sustain. She was watching through her scope. The valley below was long and shallow, maybe 300 meters wide at its broadest point, flanked on both sides by ridges covered in pine. A stream ran along the eastern edge, barely visible through the trees, catching light in small silver flashes when the cloud cover shifted. It was the kind of terrain that looked peaceful to civilians and looked like a killing ground to anyone who had studied war long enough. The valley funneled movement. It limited exit options. It gave elevated positions enormous advantages. Whoever had chosen it as the location for this ambush had known exactly what they were doing. She had to give them that much. The scout unit had entered the valley at 0642. She had been watching them from the moment they emerged from the tree lean on the northern end, 12 men moving in a tactical column, spaced correctly, scanning correctly, doing everything right by the textbook. She had watched their team leader, a stocky man in his 40s with sergeant major's insignia, someone who moved with the specific kind of unhurried confidence that comes from surviving many situations that should have killed you, pause at the valley entrance, and look around. She had watched him make the calculation. The valley was the fastest route to their objective. The valley looked clear. The valley was, by every visual indicator available to him, safe. He had made the wrong call. She did not blame him. She understood it. The enemy setup was excellent. 47 men, positioned in two broad arcs, one on the eastern ridge, one folding around the southern end of the valley to block retreat. They had used the terrain intelligently, placed their heaviest weapons on the high points, kept their communication tight. She had watched them move into position over the course of 3 hours, long before the scout unit arrived, and she had counted them methodically and logged the positions of every crew-served weapon and every command element she could identify. The man giving orders was positioned on the eastern ridge, slightly behind the main line, with 2 radio operators and what looked like a forward observer. Classic command setup, protected enough to survive the opening contact, exposed enough to see the whole valley. She had put a small mental marker on him in the first hour and had not stopped tracking his movements since. There were 47 of them. There was one of her. She had run the math many times in those cold, dark hours before dawn, in the space between calculations where the mind goes quiet and something rawer takes over, and the math kept coming out the same way. There was no version of this engagement where she walked away clean. There was a version where the scout unit survived, and that version required her to do things in a very specific order at a very specific time, and the margin for error in that version was approximately 0. She had accepted this the same way she accepted the cold and the discomfort and the 6 hours of stillness, not with drama, not with fear, but with the flat practical acknowledgement of someone who had chosen this work knowing exactly what it asked of her. She pressed her cheek against the stock of her SVD and breathed. Below, the scout unit was now 400 meters into the valley. They were moving well. The point man was sharp, his head on a swivel, checking both ridges regularly. But checking ridges from a valley floor is not the same as seeing what is hiding in them, and the enemy had chosen their concealment positions with care. The ambush would spring when a unit reached the pinch point, the place where the valley narrowed and the stream curved inward from the east, and the terrain forced the column into a tighter spacing. She estimated 8 minutes, maybe 10. She shifted her attention back to the eastern ridge. The command element was in place. The 2 radio operators were crouched low, handsets ready. The forward observer had his binoculars up, tracking the scout unit's progress. The man in charge, she had started thinking of him as the colonel, though she had no idea of his actual rank, was standing slightly behind a large pine, just enough cover to be smart about it, watching the valley below with the relaxed attention of someone watching a clock they know is running in their favor. He was going to give a signal. When the scout unit hit the pinch point, he was going to give a signal, and 47 weapons were going to open fire simultaneously, and 12 men in the valley were going to have approximately 4 seconds to find cover in terrain specifically chosen to offer almost none. She needed to act before that signal. This was the constraint. This was the narrow door everything had to fit through. If she waited until the ambush sprang, she could disrupt it, but she could not stop it. Too many weapons too spread out, the unit already caught in the kill zone. She needed to hit the command element before the colonel gave the order. She needed to eliminate the 2 radio operators simultaneously with or immediately after to prevent the ambush from being coordinated even if individual fighters decided to open up on their own initiative. She needed to do all of this in a sequence fast enough that the ambush never became a coherent event. The sequence she had worked out went like this. The colonel first. He was the decision, the signal, the nerve that made the whole operation move. Then, the forward observer, who would otherwise immediately redirect the fighters. Then, the first radio operator, then the second. For shots, the first 3 had to land within about 4 seconds of each other. After that, she would move, not run, move, controlled, to her secondary position 40 meters to the left, and begin working the heavy weapons on the eastern ridge before their crews could get oriented to where she was firing from. 4 shots in 4 seconds, then relocate. She had done harder things. She watched the scout unit pass the 300-meter mark inside the valley. The point man paused briefly, crouching, looking at something on the ground. A track, maybe, or a disturbed area of soil. Something had caught his attention. She watched him study it for 3 seconds, then stand and resume movement. Whatever he had seen, he had not flagged it as critical. She understood why. A single anomaly in the terrain is not a threat assessment. It is a data point, and one data point does not stop a 12-man unit in the middle of the movement to contact unless it is very specific. The pinch point was 200 meters ahead of them. She had maybe 5 minutes. She settled into her breathing. This was the part that looked like nothing from the outside. A woman lying still in the pine needles, barely moving, eyes behind a scope, but was in fact the most demanding thing she did, the thing that separated what she was from what most people were. She was not relaxing. She was doing the opposite of relaxing. She was achieving a state of total physical stillness while keeping every cognitive and perceptual faculty in a condition of high, sharp readiness. It felt from the inside like standing very still at the edge of something very loud. The colonel shifted his weight. He looked at his watch. She adjusted her hold by 2 millimeters. The scout unit passed the 250 mark. In the eastern trees, she could see the nearest ambush element. 4 men, prone, weapons oriented down into the valley. They were still, disciplined. She noted their position and filed it. They were not in her first sequence. They would be in her second. She had a mental map of the eastern ridge that she had built over 3 hours of observation, position by position, and she intended to work through it methodically once the command element was down. The question was how the individual fighters would respond to losing their command, whether they would push forward on their own initiative or hold, whether they would pivot to find her or keep their weapons on the valley floor. People responded differently to sudden loss of command. Some froze, some panicked, some became more dangerous, not less, because fear and aggression occupy the same room, and sometimes the wrong one gets the door. She would find out. The scout unit was at 200 meters from the pinch point. The colonel raised his right hand slightly, a preparatory gesture, getting ready to give the signal. She exhaled. Slow. The reticle was steady on the colonel's center of mass. She had her preferred aiming point, a spot just below the sternum, where the major blood vessels cluster and the diaphragm sits. She had made this shot many times. She did not think about it as a moral event. She thought about it as a technical problem with a correct and an incorrect solution, and she intended to produce the correct one. This was not coldness. This was compartmentalization, a specific cognitive architecture that the work required, and that she had built carefully over years, brick by brick, because the alternative was to be unable to function when functioning was the only thing standing between 12 men and their deaths. She thought about Sergeant Major Kovalenko's face at the valley entrance, the pause, the calculation, the wrong call. He had a wife. She did not know this factually. She assumed it the way she assumed most things about people, from how they moved, how they held their weapons, whether their eyes looked like they had something to come home to. His eyes had looked like that, tired and responsible and oriented towards something outside the immediate situation. She did not want that man to die in this valley. She fired. The sound was enormous and immediate, and she was already moving the barrel, already finding the forward observer, already pressing, and the second shot went while the first was still echoing, and then the first radio operator, and she had to pause a half second because he had shifted position in the last 30 seconds, and she needed to find him, and there he was still crouching, just slightly left of where she had expected, and she breathed and pressed, and he was down, and she was already rolling left, moving, pulling herself across the pine needles to her secondary position, because the eastern ridge had heard 3 shots now and was starting to orient. For shots. For seconds. 1 miss. The forward observer. She had seen him go down, but she was not certain of a hit. In her secondary position, she got her scope back on the eastern ridge command area and saw the colonel down, the first radio operator down, and the forward observer moving. Injured, not dead, crawling toward cover behind a fallen tree trunk. She did not have time for a follow-up. The eastern ridge was live now. She could hear shouting, the specific, disorganized shouting of fighters whose plan has just broken apart in their hands. Individual weapons were beginning to orient toward her last firing position. In 30 seconds, they would begin a search pattern. She looked at the valley. The scout unit had stopped. They had heard the shots, 3 shots coming from behind the ambush, and the sergeant major had done what a competent commander does with unexpected information. He had put his unit into cover immediately and started orienting to the new information rather than the original plan. She could see them in the tree line along the eastern stream bank, weapons up, heads working. They were confused. They had no idea what was happening. She needed to give them a direction. She put 3 fast shots into the eastern ridge, spaced across the heaviest weapons position she had identified, not to destroy them. Not enough time for precision at this range, but to suppress them, to interrupt the cruise, to keep their heads down while the scout unit figured out that the ambush had been compromised and that their window to move was now. Move, she thought. You have to move now. Get out of the valley. She did not have a radio. She had not expected to have radio contact with the scout unit. She was operating alone, as she had been for 3 days, on a mission that had started as reconnaissance and had become something else when she had come over the ridge at 0115 and found 47 men setting up to kill 12. She could not tell them what to do. She could only make the terrain point in one direction. She shifted to the southern arc of the ambush, the element that was meant to seal the valley's southern exit, and began working through it. These fighters had a more difficult problem than the eastern ridge element. They were positioned to intercept the unit moving south, but the scout unit was now static, and the shots were coming from the north, and they had no command to reorient them. She could see indecision in the way they were moving. Heads up, looking toward the ridge, looking toward the valley, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. The command element was down. No one was telling them anything. She put rounds into the 2 positions that had the best angle on the valley's southern exit, forcing the fighters there into hard cover, creating a gap in the seal. The gap was narrow, maybe 30 meters of relatively open ground before the southern tree line. But 30 meters was enough if a unit moved fast and used the stream bank for concealment. In the valley, the sergeant major had made his decision. She saw the unit break from cover and start south, tight, fast, using the stream bank perfectly. The sergeant major was directing them with hand signals, keeping them moving, keeping them low. They had no idea where the threat was, no idea who was shooting from the ridge, but they were moving toward the gap, and that was all that mattered. She kept the southern exit suppressed. 40 seconds. 60. The unit was halfway to the southern tree line. Something on the eastern ridge had gotten itself organized. She heard the distinctive sound of a crew-served weapon orienting, the mechanical clunk of a heavy machine gun being traversed, and she swung her scope back to the ridge and found the position, and she had maybe 3 seconds before it opened up on the scout unit in the valley below, which was exposed on the stream bank, moving no hard cover between them and that gun. She did not have a clear shot. The gun was behind a rock outcrop with only the barrel exposed, and she could not hit the crew without a better angle, and she did not have a better angle. She took the shot anyway. The round hit rock. She heard it, a flat crack distinct from the shot itself. But the crew flinched. Even trained gun crews flinch when a rifle round hits a rock 2 feet from their faces, and the gun traversed away from the valley for a second, and that second was what the scout unit needed. She saw them hit the southern tree line. She counted 1, 2, 4, 7, 10, 11, 12. 12. All 12. She let out a breath that had apparently been waiting some time to be released. The eastern ridge was fully awake now, and angry, and looking for her with a systematic efficiency that told her these were experienced men who had done this kind of thing before. She needed to be somewhere else. She had already identified her withdrawal route, a dry creek bed running north along the backside of a ridge, providing dead ground from the eastern positions, leading eventually to a boulder field where she could move without being silhouetted, and then to the thick pine forest on the backside of the hill where she had stashed her kit. She took one more shot at the command area. Not because anyone was still there, but because she wanted them to think she was staying, wanted them oriented to this position while she was already moving, and then she pulled back, slow and deliberate, keeping her profile below the ridge crest, moving in the way she had learned to move when moving was the same thing as staying alive. The cold hit her when she stood. 6 hours on the ground, and her joints had opinions about it. She noted them and set them aside and moved. Behind her, on the eastern ridge, she could hear the enemy starting to sweep. They were professional about it. She had to respect that even as she was working to stay ahead of it. She moved through the creek bed, keeping low, counting her steps, letting the terrain tell her where to be. The forest absorbed sound oddly. The shouting from the ridge seemed sometimes close, sometimes impossibly distant, and she navigated by map memory and the faint morning light filtering through the pine canopy above. She reached the boulder field 8 minutes later. She stopped and listened. The sound from the ridge were receding. They were sweeping north, not toward her. Either they had the wrong vector on her firing position, or she had gained enough ground that they had passed her in their search pattern. Either way, she moved into the pines and let them close around her. She found her kit where she had left it, under a flat rock, wrapped in canvas, exactly as she had packed it at 0200 that morning when she had still been a reconnaissance asset observing terrain and had not yet understood what she was observing terrain for. She sat against a tree and ate a piece of hard bread and drank from her water bottle and Let herself exist as a person for a few minutes. Let the cold and the silence and the weight of the morning sit in her body, the way these things need to sit sometimes before you can carry them correctly. 12 men had walked out of that valley. She did not know their names. She had never spoken to any of them. She did not know the sergeant major's name, or whether his eyes had been right about the wife, or what any of them thought about what had happened in that valley today. They probably thought it was a called-in airstrike, or a covering element they hadn't been briefed on, or one of those chaotic battlefield events that happens and saves you, and you spend the rest of your life being slightly unnerved by. She finished the hard bread. She had 30 kilometers of hostile terrain to cover before she reached a position from which she could re-establish communication with her unit. She had done longer. She picked up her kit, checked her compass, and oriented north-northwest. She moved. The forest closed around her like it had been waiting. She was 3 hours into the withdrawal before her left knee started speaking to her in a language that had no polite translation. Yeva had known the knee since she was 19. A bad landing during training, the kind of injury that gets called minor in the field because the field does not have space for major, and the knee had a specific opinion about cold weather and sustained crouching and 6 hours of lying on frozen ground, which was that these things were unacceptable and she should stop doing them immediately. She noted its position and kept moving. The knee would have to file its complaint somewhere else. She had 30 kilometers of hostile terrain and no support and a body that needed to cover ground before the search pattern from the ridge widened enough to become a real problem. She had been thinking about the forward observer. The shot she was not certain of. She had seen him go down, but she had also seen him crawling, injured, which meant she had either hit him and the wound was not immediately incapacitating, or she had missed, and the fall was the result of him diving for cover when the colonel dropped. The second possibility bothered her, with a particular cold specificity. Not because a wounded forward observer was necessarily a threat she needed to resolve, but because a living forward observer was someone who had seen her muzzle flash, or had the right angle on it, or would spend the next 72 hours staring at a map with a compass and a ruler and calculating back azimuths until he had a very good idea of where she had been. They already knew she existed. That was unavoidable. 3 shots from a single position in under 4 seconds, with the command element as the obvious targeting priority, told them a great deal about what had happened. They knew it was a trained shooter. They knew it was a planned interdiction, not a chance encounter. They might, if they were thorough, piece together that she had been in position before they arrived, which would tell them she had been watching them set up, which would tell them this was a deliberate disruption of a deliberate ambush, which meant intelligence and intent and a specific operational capability that their command would find deeply unpleasant to think about. She was not just a complication for them. She was a message. She had not meant it as a message. She had meant it as saving 12 people. But the two things were the same action from different angles, and she did not have the luxury of controlling which angle they chose to look at. She stopped at the crest of a low ridge and glassed the terrain behind her. Nothing moving. The search pattern she had heard organizing on the eastern ridge had not yet extended this far west. She had maybe 2 hours before they would have a systematic effort reaching her current area, assuming they were good. Assuming they were very good, maybe 90 minutes. She reset her pace estimate accordingly and moved down the far side of the ridge. The terrain here was different from the valley. Open pine forest gave way to mixed birch and scrub, the kind of ground that offered poor concealment, but good movement, and she alternated between the two, staying in the birch when she needed speed and pulling into the pine edges when she needed to stop and listen. She had a route. The route was the product of 2 hours of map study the previous night by a small red lens torch, lying on her stomach in a shallow hide 3 kilometers from the valley, when she had still not fully understood what she was preparing for. She had come over the ridge at 0115, meaning to observe a suspected supply route. What she had found instead was 47 men in the process of setting up the most patient, most precisely positioned ambush she had seen in 4 years of operational work. She had lain on the ridge and watched them for 30 minutes before the shape of it became clear, and then clear became certain, and certain became the question she had been sitting with ever since, the question that had occupied the cold hours before dawn more thoroughly than any physical discomfort. She had not been sent here to do this. There were protocols. There were coordination procedures. In an ideal world, she would have gotten a message to her command. Her command would have radioed the scout unit's command. The scout unit's route would have been redirected, and 47 men would have sat in a valley for hours waiting for a column that never came. Clean. No contact, no exposure, no risk to her or her mission. The radio was the problem. She had been running under emission control for 72 hours. Her orders were specific. No transmissions until she had reached the designated communication point on the far side of the ridge system. The operational reason for this was solid. Enemy electronic warfare capability in this zone was rated high, and a single transmission could give them a position fix within minutes. She understood the order. She had written similar orders herself for other operations in other places. The reasoning was correct. The reasoning was also, in the current situation, catastrophically beside the point. She could have broken emission control, could have gotten a position on the radio for 60 seconds, transmitted what she knew, taken the risk of the fix. The honest answer, the one she had examined carefully in the cold dark, was that she had considered it and decided against it for reasons that were partly tactical and partly something else, a judgment call that she would have to justify later and that she was not entirely certain she could justify cleanly. The risk of the transmission was real. The time it would take for her command to act on the information and for that action to reach the scout unit was also real. She had run the numbers, and the numbers had come out badly. Or that was the story she had been telling herself. The other story, the one she trusted less because she was in it, was simpler. She was on the ridge. She had the angle. She had the capability. The scout unit did not have time. And she had made a decision the way people sometimes make decisions. Not from a spreadsheet, but from something deeper and faster and harder to audit. She was still running from the consequences of that decision, literally and otherwise. The scrubland broke into a shallow draw running roughly northeast, which was useful. She dropped into it and followed it, letting the low ground conceal her movement, checking her compass every 100 meters. The draw would take her close to a paved road that she needed to cross before the search effort expanded. The road was a risk, open ground for maybe 40 meters, but the alternative was a 6-kilometer detour that she did not have time for. She was thinking about the sergeant major. She did not know why she kept returning to him specifically. There had been 12 men in that valley. She had been watching all 12. But the sergeant major, the way he had paused at the valley entrance, the specific quality of his decision-making, the way he had responded to the first shots with exactly the right response. He had taken a piece of her attention and not returned it. He was going to file a report. Whatever had happened in that valley was going to become a report, and the report was going to describe incoming fire from the ridge above the ambush position, and somebody in his command was going to pull the report and see that the incoming fire had preceded the ambush initiation by approximately 4 seconds and had specifically targeted the command element, and that somebody was going to start asking questions that were interesting questions. Who was on that ridge? What were they doing there? Were they ours? The last question was the one with weight. Because if the sergeant major's command started looking for the friendly asset that had covered their scout unit in grid reference such and such on the morning of such and such, they were going to find Yeva's unit's operational logs, and those logs were going to show her as a reconnaissance asset in that zone. And then somebody with enough authority to access both files was going to make a connection that led straight back to her. At which point she was going to have a significant conversation with her commanding officer. She had been running the conversation in her head during the long, cold march. It went through several versions. In the best version, her CO, Major Svetlana Dychenko, a woman who had the specific kind of even temperament that comes from having been genuinely furious about everything for long enough that you run out of fury and arrive at something cleaner, reviewed the situation and agreed that the decision to engage had been the correct one given the time constraints and the scout unit's exposure, and the matter was filed under acceptable operational variance and closed. In the second best version, there were some pointed questions about emission control protocols, and the conversation lasted 3 days and was uncomfortable throughout, but ultimately resolved in her favor. In a version she did not linger on, the conversation went differently. She heard the road before she saw it, the low hum of a vehicle, distant, moving left to right across her path. She froze in the draw and waited while it passed, a truck, military, too far and too fast for her to identify markings, and then waited another 90 seconds while the sound died away, then moved to the draw's edge and checked the road in both directions. Empty. She crossed in 8 seconds low and fast, and was back in the tree line before she had time to think about it as an event. The forest on the far side of the road was thicker. Old growth, probably logged once in the last century, and allowed to return, the trees growing in the dense, opportunistic way that second-growth forests have, crowding each other, creating the kind of undergrowth that makes movement slow and loud unless you know how to read it. She knew how to read it. She had spent 3 years of her career working in forests not unlike this one, in different countries, different seasons, always the same basic equation. Silence, patience, the correct relationship between speed and exposure. She had grown up in a village 40 kilometers from the nearest city, in a region that prided itself on producing people who were serious about quiet. Her father had taken her hunting from the age of 6. Not because girls went hunting in their village, which they did not, but because her father had wanted a son and received daughters and had decided to solve this problem by treating his eldest daughter as the son he had not gotten, which had resulted in a childhood that was equal parts confusing and useful. She knew how forests worked. She knew how animals moved through them. She knew what disturbed terrain looked like and what caused it and how long ago. These were not skills she had learned in the military, though the military had refined them. They were skills she had from before. She checked her watch. 11:20. She had been moving for 5 hours. Her knee had escalated its complaints to something approaching a formal grievance. She found a dense stand of spruce, crawled into the center of it, the lower branches forming a natural hide, the needles thick enough to break her outline, and ate the second piece of hard bread and drank carefully from her water bottle and sat very still and listened to the forest. Nothing moving. No sound from the direction of the ridge. No aircraft. She had been listening for aircraft since the valley because if they had air assets and they had her general area, aircraft changed everything. Nothing. She let herself think about what she had done. Not evaluate it. Not justify it. Think about it. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to her in a way that she found hard to articulate even to herself. Evaluation was for the report, for the conversation with Major Dychenko, for the operational review. Thinking about it was for here, under the spruce, alone with the cold, and the distance she had just covered, and the sound of her own breathing. She had killed 3 people, possibly 4, if the forward observer had not survived the wound. She had done this before in other places, and the accumulation of it was a specific kind of weight that did not get lighter over time, so much as it got more familiar. She did not romanticize it. She did not, as some soldiers did, manage it by deciding that the people on the other side of her scope were not people. They were people. The colonel had been a person with a command role and a functional mind and a careful plan, and she had ended him in the middle of his careful plan, and that was a fact she kept with her the way you keep a stone in your pocket. Not ignored, not dwelled on, just carried. The 12 men in the valley were also people. That weight was different. She noticed the difference without being able to fully explain it. The forward observer had been crawling. Some of them had been lying still. The sergeant major had been directing his unit with the specific competent calm of someone who intends to bring everyone home. And she had watched him do it, and all 12 had reached the trillion. She knew, rationally, that this was not a clean ledger, that doing a necessary thing did not erase the cost of it, that the cost and the necessity were both real and both permanent and did not cancel each other out no matter how the arithmetic looked on paper. She had met soldiers who believed they did cancel out, and they were either lying to themselves or had arrived at a simplicity of moral calculation that she had never been able to reach and was not sure she wanted to. She sat with all of it under the spruce. Then she put it away in the specific interior location she had built for these things over 4 years, and she thought about the next 12 kilometers. The communication point was on the far side of a ridgeline known on her map as Hill 347, a designation that told you nothing about the hill's character, which was steep and rocky on its southern face and covered in knee-deep heather on its northern approach. She had 3 hours of good light left. If she moved well and the terrain cooperated, she could reach the communication point before dark, transmit her report, and receive instructions about the extraction route. If something went wrong with the terrain, or the search expanded faster than expected, or her knee decided to escalate from complaint to full refusal, she would spend another night in the field and transmit at dawn. She had done both before. She preferred not to on this occasion because the longer she was in the field without contact, the longer her command operated without knowing what had happened in the valley, and the longer that gap ran, the more complicated her eventual explanation became. She also preferred not to because she was tired in a way that had layers to it. The surface tiredness of 5 hours of movement on insufficient food and under that a deeper thing, the particular fatigue of sustained high-alert functioning, the kind that accumulates in people who operate alone in contested terrain for extended periods, and manifests eventually as a fine-grained erosion of the edges of things, a slight softening of the precision that the work requires and that she insisted on maintaining. She needed sleep. She would not get it yet. She checked her compass, oriented to Hill 347, ate the last of the hard bread, and moved. The afternoon closed around her as she walked, the light shifting from the flat gray of late morning to the amber thinning of early evening, the forest changing character as she moved, the dense second growth giving way to older stands where the trees were far apart, and the ground was clear, and she could move faster but was more exposed, then back into cover, then into a broad marshy area that her map had suggested was passable, and that turned out to be passable in the loosest interpretation of the term, a kilometer of ankle-deep cold water and vegetation that grabbed at her boots and made every step deliberate and loud and unpleasant. She crossed it in 22 minutes. Her boots would not be dry for 2 days. She climbed the southern face of Hill 347 as the light was going. The rock was solid under her hands, at least good stable granite, not the crumbling kind, and she moved up it methodically, using the technique she had learned in the Carpathians 3 years ago, 3 points of contact always, weight shifted over the feet, eyes checking the rock before trusting it. The knee expressed its views on uphill rock climbing at considerable volume. She reached the crest as the last of the direct light disappeared from the sky, and the world went to specific flat gray-blue of dusk in northern forests. From the crest she could see, to the north and east, the lights of a town she did not need to know the name of. It served as a navigation reference point, and nothing else. To the west, nothing, just the dark shapes of the forest rolling away into the beginning of night. Behind her, to the south, the general direction of the valley she had left that morning, already too far away to be visible as anything specific, already becoming part of the day's accumulation. The communication point was 30 meters from the crest, in a slight depression on the northern face, a natural bowl in the rock that shielded radio transmission from southern observers. She reached it, set up her equipment with cold hands that had stopped cooperating fully somewhere in the marshy kilometer, checked frequencies, checked battery, composed her transmission in her head. She had been composing it since the valley. It was short. It was clear. It contained the facts, not the weight of the facts. She keyed the radio. Alpha 6, this is Lynx. Authentication, Foxtrot 79er. I have a contact report and an incident report. Request acknowledgement. Static. Then, a voice she recognized. Corporal Tarasenko, the night duty operator, who had a specific flatness in his radio manner that suggested he took the formality of communication seriously. Lynx, Alpha 6. Authentication confirmed. Send contact report. She sent it. 45 seconds. Position, time, enemy strength, disposition, what she had done, what the outcome had been, current location status. Everything in the cold, clean language of operational reporting, the language that turns mornings into data, that converts the sound of a rifle and the sight of men falling into lines of factual text that go into files. Tarasenko read it back without comment. Then, wait one, Lynx. I'm waking Major Dychenko. She sat in the rock depression and waited. The sky had gone fully dark. The stars over Hill 347 were unobstructed and very bright. She had learned their names when she was a child, and she could still name most of them, though she rarely had occasion to, and she did not use them for navigation tonight, because she had a compass that was more reliable than personal sentiment about the night sky. The radio crackled. A different voice. Familiar, even through the compression. Lynx. This is 6 Actual. 6 Actual, Lynx, Yeva said. Good evening, Major. A pause. The kind of pause that is also a question. Walk me through the decision to engage, Major Dychenko said. And Yeva Marchenko, sitting on a cold rock on Hill 347 with wet boots and a complaining knee and 12 hours of accumulated weight, did exactly that. Major Svetlana Dychenko had a voice like a door closing carefully in a room where someone was already asleep. Precise. Controlled. The kind of voice that had learned long ago that raising itself was a waste of a resource. When she spoke on the radio, even through compression and static and whatever atmospheric interference the northern hills were producing tonight, you heard the door. You heard the care of it. She listened to Yeva's account without interrupting. This was unusual. Most commanders interrupted. They heard the first third of a situation report and began filing the information into pre-existing categories and asking questions designed to confirm their categorization, which meant they heard what they expected to hear rather than what was being said. Daichenko did not do this. She had a quality of attention that Yeva had respected from their first operational meeting 2 years ago, a flat, total receptiveness that processed incoming information without editorializing it in real time. Yeva told her everything. The 0115 observation, the 47 men, the 3-hour analysis of the ambush setup, the decision not to break a mission control, the decision to engage, the sequence of shots, the scout unit's withdrawal, the forward observer she was uncertain about. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough for her to check the radio signal strength indicator out of reflex. Forward observer, Daichenko said. Describe the wound indicator. He went down on the first fall, then crawled. Left leg or hip. Moving toward the fallen trunk at grid. She gave a grid. I did not have time for a follow-up shot. I was already relocating. Did you see him reach the trunk? Negative. I was in movement. Another silence. Shorter this time. Processing, not evaluation. The scout unit, Daichenko said. 12 out of 12. 12. I counted them crossing into the southern tree line. You're certain? Major. One word. The word contained everything it needed to contain. Daichenko did not ask again. Extraction route, Daichenko said. I'm pulling up your current grid. Give me a moment. Yeva waited. On the dark hill, the cold had settled into something serious. She was aware of her hands in a way she was not usually aware of them. The specific cold stiffness of fingers that had been doing technical work for too many hours in inadequate temperatures. She flexed them methodically, the way she had been trained to, keeping the blood moving, keeping the fine motor function available. Extraction in 36 hours, Daichenko said. Grid follows. She read a grid reference that Yeva recognized as a flat agricultural area approximately 12 kilometers north-northwest of her current position. Open enough for a vehicle approach. Remote enough to be low risk. I want you there by 0400. I am sending Sergeant Boyko. Boyko. She knew Boyko. He was the kind of driver who communicated his emotions through gear changes and who had never, in her experience, arrived late for anything. Copy, she said. Major. The incident report. You'll need to flag it upward. I know what I need to flag upward, Sergeant. The door, closing carefully. Yes, ma'am. Get to the extraction point. 36 hours. Don't do anything else interesting. A pause, so brief it might have been static. I mean that literally, Marchenko. Understood. The radio went quiet. She broke down the equipment with cold hands, packed it, oriented her compass to north-northwest, and moved off the hill into the darkness. The farmhouse was abandoned in the way that certain buildings become abandoned in certain kinds of conflicts. Not gradually, not by the slow process of people deciding to leave, but overnight, in the sudden categorical way that happens when leaving is no longer a choice. The furniture was still inside. She had seen through a broken window, using her torch briefly, a table set with plates that had not been washed. A child's drawing pinned to the wall above the fireplace, curling at the corners. A coat on a hook near the door that someone had not grabbed on the way out, because the way out had been faster than grabbing a coat. She did not go inside. An abandoned building in contested terrain has a specific risk profile. It is an obvious shelter point, and obvious shelter points are places that people checking for you will check. She found instead a collapsed outbuilding at the far edge of what had been a kitchen garden, where the roof had come down on one side, creating a low triangular space against the remaining wall, and she crawled into it and arranged her kit and put the space blanket underneath her rather than on top of her, and ate 2 protein tablets that tasted like chalk and disappointment. And then she slept. She slept the way she always slept in the field. Not deeply, not completely, but efficiently, the way a system powers down to its minimum viable state rather than shutting off. A part of her remained running, cataloging sounds, maintaining the tripwire. She woke twice. Once when something moved in the kitchen garden, a cat, probably feral. She heard the specific delicate footfall of small predator navigation, and once for no external reason she could identify, some interior alarm with a threshold she could not calibrate, and both times she lay still and listened until the silence reestablished itself as safe and then returned to the not-quite sleep. At 0330, she was moving again. The terrain between the farmhouse and the extraction point was the least difficult she had crossed since the valley. Rolling agricultural land, winter fields, the kind of ground that offered almost no concealment but was passable in the dark and well within her movement capability for the time available. She moved along fence lines where they existed, using them as navigation aids, keeping low when she crossed open ground, letting the darkness and the cold do the concealment work. She was thinking about the forward observer. She had been thinking about him on and off since the ridge, the uncertainty of the hit, the crawling figure, the fallen trunk he had been moving toward. In the operational sense, the calculus was clear enough. A wounded enemy combatant who had been present at a command element that was now disrupted was a diminished threat, particularly given that the whole ambush operation had collapsed and whatever unit he belonged to was now in a reactive rather than offensive posture. He was not a problem she needed to solve. The forward observer was staying in her head for a different reason. She had taken a shot. She was nearly certain it had been accurate. She was not entirely certain. And the fraction of uncertainty that she was not filling with confirmation was filling instead with the specific discomfort of incomplete information in a high-stakes situation. She did not know if he was dead. She did not know if he was alive and in pain and alone on a cold ridge. She did not know if he had made it to cover before he lost consciousness. She did not know what he looked like. She knew his tactical function. She knew his approximate position on the ridge. She knew the angle she had been shooting from, and the range, and the wind adjustment she had made, and the mechanics of the shot. These things she knew with precision. The rest of him she did not know, and could not know, and would not know, and she understood all of this clearly, and it did not make the not knowing easier to carry. This was the part of the work that she did not talk about. Not because she was protecting herself. She had been on the receiving end of enough operational debriefs to know that the system had limited interest in the effective experience of soldiers who did their jobs correctly, but because she had learned early that talking about it produced reactions that were rarely useful. Other soldiers either shared the weight and became burdened by its discussion, or did not share it and became confused by its existence. Neither conversation helped, so she carried it alone in the interior location with the other things, and she walked north-northwest through the cold, dark fields, and she let the weight be what it was. The extraction point was a track junction at the edge of a birch stand, a flat area of compacted earth where farm vehicles had turned for years, the ground marked by a shallow depression that showed up clearly on topographic maps. She arrived at 0348, 12 minutes early. She found a position inside the birch stand that gave her a sight line to the track junction and put her back to a tree and waited. Boyko arrived at 0401, a civilian vehicle, an older model with a specific patched and maintained look of something that had been kept running past its natural lifespan by someone who understood engines and had no intention of spending money on a replacement. The headlights cut once, the agreed signal, and she moved out of the birch stand and crossed the vehicle and got in. Boyko looked at her the way he always looked at people returning from extended field operations. Not with concern exactly, more with the specific assessment of someone checking whether the returned item needed maintenance before being put back into service. He had a thermos of tea on the center console. She took it without being offered it and drank, and he put the vehicle in gear and moved. "Long one," he said. This was for Boyko, an extensive inquiry into her welfare. "Standard," she said. This was between them a complete answer. They drove north in silence, which was exactly what she needed. And he did not ask further questions, which was exactly what she needed, and the tea was very hot and very strong and tasted like a specific kind of civilization that she had been living a long way from for the past several days. She was back at the base by 0640. Major Dychenko's office was the same size as everyone else's, but looked smaller because of what Dychenko had done to the available space. The walls covered in operational maps to the exclusion of everything decorative, the desk buried in files, but buried in a specific organized way, stacked by project and priority, everything findable if you knew the system. There was a single photograph on the desk, turned at an angle that made it visible to the room rather than to the person sitting behind the desk, which Yeva had always thought of as a specific kind of statement about what Dychenko considered important, sharing the thing with the room rather than keeping it for herself. The photograph was of two women. Dychenko was younger in it. The other woman, Yeva did not know. Dychenko looked up when Yeva entered. She looked at Yeva for a moment with the flat, receptive attention she used for incoming information, as if reading something in Yeva's current condition that the upcoming conversation should factor in. "Sit down," she said. "Do you want coffee?" No thank you, Major. I'm going to have coffee. She poured it herself, from a battered percolator on a side table, without asking again. She sat. She pulled a file toward her and opened it without looking at it. Tell me again. From the beginning. This was also not unusual. Daichenko believed in oral accounts before written ones, because the oral account was still close to the experience and contained things that the written account, which was composed, considered, sanitized by the formal requirements of the reporting format, would lose. She wanted the morning before she got the document. Yeva told it again, exactly as she had told on the radio, except that in this room, in daylight, with a chair under her and a roof above her, and the tea from Boyko's thermos still sitting warmly inside her chest, the account felt different in the telling. Not different in the facts. Different in the weight of each piece, the way certain moments wanted more room than the radio had allowed. She did not give them more room. She told it cleanly, as she had been trained. Daichenko listened, made one note on a pad beside the file. Just one. When Yeva finished, Daichenko looked at the note she had made, which Yeva could not read from across the desk. The emission control decision, Daichenko said. Not a question. A place where she was waiting for Yeva to go. Yeva had been there before the meeting. I ran the timeline, she said. 60-second transmission, acknowledge and authenticate, relay to Scout Unit Command. Assuming I reached someone with the authority to reroute immediately, minimum action time was 12 to 15 minutes. The Scout unit was inside 10 minutes of the kill zone when I identified the full ambush setup. There was not a clean comms option that resolved inside the available window. You're certain of the timeline. I'm certain of my estimates. I would have transmitted rather than engaged if I had believed there was a viable comms option. Would you? Not a challenge. A genuine inquiry. There was a difference. Yes, Yeva said. I would have preferred the clean option. I did not have it. Daichenko looked at her for a moment. The flat attention. Then, she looked at the file. I'm inclined to agree with your assessment, she said. The Scout Unit's command has already submitted an incident report. They're describing the fire as unidentified friendly or possible partisan asset. They have not attributed it to us. They will. Eventually, yes. When they have access to the right operational records. We will disclose before that happens. She closed the file. I'm filing your contact report and your incident report together. The emission control deviation will be noted. There will be a review. I understand. The review will be conducted by Colonel Petrick. She looked at Yeva directly. You know, Petrick. She did. Petrick had a specific philosophy about field discretion, the kind that held that individual soldiers operating without direct supervision were generally incapable of correct decision-making, and that the appropriate response to an ambiguous situation was inaction pending instructions, which was a philosophy that had a coherent internal logic, and that collapsed entirely in contact with the world as it actually operated. She had been on the wrong side of Petrick's philosophy before, in a different operation, 3 years ago. I know Petrick, she said. He is thorough, Daichenko said, which was her way of saying, be prepared. I will provide him with my assessment. I believe your decision was correct under the circumstances. She looked at the window for a moment. There was no view from it, just a concrete wall and a stretch of gray sky. I also believe it was the kind of correct that is harder to defend than incorrect would have been to explain. Yeva said nothing. 12 men, Daichenko said. Not to Yeva. To herself, perhaps, or to the gray sky. Then she picked up the file and set it to one side. Get cleaned up. Get some sleep. I want a written report on my desk by 1800. Yes, ma'am. Marchenko. Yeva had stood. She stopped. The forward observer. You reported uncertainty on the hit. Yes. Intel is tracking a medical evacuation for the Eastern Ridge area. This morning, 0730 hours. Single casualty, lower body wound, critical. She looked at the file, not at Yeva. For what it's worth. Yeva held that information for a moment. What it was worth was something she could not calculate in Daichenko's office, standing in the morning light with the tile floor cold under her feet and the accumulated hours of the previous day pressing against the backs of her eyes. She would have to find the space for it later, in the interior location, where it would sit with the rest of the things that did not have clean resolutions. The forward observer had been evacuated. Critical condition. She had hit him. He had not died immediately. She did not know if he would die later, in some field hospital, from a wound she had put in his lower body on a cold ridge above a valley that 12 other men had walked out of because she had. Thank you, Major, she said. She left. The shower was hot, and she stayed in it longer than she meant to. The knee, under warm water, moderated its position from formal grievance to pointed recommendation. She stood under the water and let it be hot and thought about nothing, or tried to think about nothing, which is not the same thing as thinking about nothing, but is sometimes as close as you can get. She thought about the farmhouse, the coat on the hook, the plates. She thought about the sergeant major's eyes at the valley entrance. She thought about a child's drawing, curling at the corners, pinned above a fireplace in an empty room. She turned off the water and dried off and dressed in clean clothes that felt remarkably specific. The sensation of clean fabric against her skin after 40-plus hours in the field had a specific quality, something almost violent in its ordinariness, and she sat on her bunk and she wrote the report. She wrote it in the flat, clean language of operations. She wrote it accurately. She wrote it in 40 minutes and sat on Dychenko's desk at 15:40, 2 hours and 20 minutes early, because the writing had gone quickly, the way writing goes quickly when you have been composing the sentences in your head since before the sun came up. Then she went back to her bunk and she slept. She did not dream. Or if she did not bring any of it back with her when she woke, which was its own kind of mercy, the small, impersonal mercy of a body that knows what it needs and takes it without ceremony, the way a forest takes rain, the way a rifle takes cold, the way a person who does very hard things for reasons they have not stopped believing in takes the darkness when it comes. Outside, somewhere to the south, across 30 kilometers of pine and birch and cold river and frozen field and one shallow valley with a stream along its eastern edge, 12 men who did not know her name were writing their own reports in their own language about a morning that had not gone the way anyone planned. The sergeant major was probably writing his right now. She wondered what he made of it. She decided she would never know, and she let that be true, and then she slept.